There were 3 things Valeria Marquez knew how to do well. Set a table for 12 in under 4 minutes, smile when she felt like crying, and walk into the most intimidating places in the world with her head high and a resume in her hand. The problem was that none of those 3 skills were working for her that morning. Café Serrano was exactly the kind of place where money didn't make noise, because it didn't need to. High ceilings with plaster moldings, dark green marble tables, waiters in black aprons who seemed to glide without touching the floor. The daily menu cost what Valeria earned in half a shift. But she had spent 3 years working at La Moraleja Golf Club. She knew exactly how to move among people who wore more money on their wrists than she had in her entire bank account. She knew not to stare, not to say too little, to smile precisely the right amount. And that morning, with her folder of resumes tucked under her arm and the determination of someone with no plan B, Valeria Marquez walked in. What she didn't have was time. She had spent 6 days going from café to café, restaurant to restaurant, hotel to hotel in central Madrid with the same folder and the same practiced smile, and 6 days coming back with no concrete offer. The rent on the room she'd found in Lavapiés was due in 12 days. And underneath all of that, like the constant sound of an alarm nobody else could hear, there was Bruno. Always Bruno. Bruno Salvatierra had entered Valeria's life the way things that end up hurting you always do. Slowly, with the appearance of good intentions, and a smile that took her far too long to learn to read. He was a man of average build who had learned to make himself larger than he was, the way he planted his feet, the way he held eye contact without blinking, the way he spoke in a low voice that forced everyone to lean toward him, as if the world owed him attention. In his neighborhood, they called him Don Bruno, with that specific mixture of fear and contempt that he interpreted as respect. He had businesses nobody asked too many questions about, contacts in places where it was better not to have contacts, and the deep, immovable conviction that the people who entered his life belonged to him. To Bruno, Valeria wasn't a person. She was property. And it had cost her 2 years to discover that. She walked up to the counter before the manager could say a word, laid the resume down, and smiled with the confidence of someone who has learned that first impressions are the only ones you can never repeat. Good morning. I'm looking for the person in charge of staffing. 3 years at La Moraleja, verifiable references, available immediately. The manager glanced down at the resume. A tactic, once the paper was already there, it was harder to ignore. You can leave it, he said. We don't have any openings at the moment. I know. That's why I brought 4 copies. 1 for you, 1 for the shift manager, 1 for the file, and 1 spare just in case. The manager's mustache made an imperceptible movement. It might have been the beginning of a smile. It was at that exact moment that the door behind her opened. Valeria knew before she turned around. She knew from the way the manager looked up and something in his expression tightened. She knew from the silence that fell over the 2 nearest tables. She knew because she had spent 2 years learning to recognize that silence. Bruno didn't enter places. He occupied them. He walked toward her slowly. No rushing, no shouting. That was what was most unsettling, the calm. The smile of a man who believes he has all the time in the world because he thinks the outcome has already been decided. What a coincidence, he said in that soft tone Valeria knew far too well, the one he used when he wanted everything to seem like a perfectly normal conversation. I went to your place. You weren't there. I don't have that place anymore. Right. He glanced at the resume, then at the manager, then at Valeria. She doesn't need work. Thank you. He said it like information, not a request, as if the decision had been made before anyone thought to ask. The manager said nothing. The people at the nearest tables developed a sudden, textbook case of temporary blindness. Bruno took her by the wrist. Not hard, Bruno never needed to be hard. Just enough for her to feel she couldn't pull away without making a scene. Not enough for anyone to call it violence. Let's go, he said quietly. Don't make a scene in a place where you don't belong. Valeria pulled her arm. Once. Twice. Bruno, let go of me. Valeria. His voice dropped a tone. Don't make me repeat myself. And it was in that exact second, wrist trapped, manager staring at the floor, that Valeria looked up and saw the man sitting at the back of the cafe. He was alone at a table for two. In the back, to the left, far from the windows, with his back to the wall, like someone who has the habit of watching who comes in. Dark suit, no tie, a cup of coffee, and a phone he was no longer looking at, because he was looking at her. Not with a spectator's curiosity. With something closer to assessment, as if in 2 seconds he had already understood more than the scene was showing. He was very attractive. Valeria noticed that in a way that was completely inconvenient for the moment she was living through. Broad shoulders under the dark suit, a firm jaw, the kind of physical presence that doesn't need to move to take up space. But what stopped her wasn't that. It was the gaze, dark, direct, and completely calm. The look of someone who couldn't remember the last time anything surprised him. Valeria didn't know who this man was. She didn't know if he was married, if he was kind, if he would help her. She only knew he was alone, and that in that moment, he was the only exit she had. She pulled free from Bruno's grip with a sharp jerk, crossed the cafe in 8 steps, pulled out the empty chair, and sat down in front of the stranger with her folder on her lap and her heart slamming against her ribs like it was trying to get out. "You're wrong," she said without turning toward Bruno, looking directly into the eyes of the man in the suit. "I'm not looking for work. I'm with my boyfriend." Silence. The man looked at her for exactly 2 seconds. 2 seconds in which Valeria had time to think she had just made the biggest mistake of her life, that this man was going to look at her like he had no idea who she was, that Bruno was going to drag her out of the chair, that she was going to end this Wednesday at a police station explaining how she had tried to use a complete stranger as a human shield in a cafe on Serrano. But then the man set his cup down on the table with absolute calm and said, "You're late, Valeria." She nearly choked on air. The man stood up. He was even taller than he'd looked sitting down, 6 foot something that filled the space around the table in a way that wasn't threatening, just inevitable. He slowly unbuttoned his jacket, came around the table, and positioned himself beside her with one hand resting lightly on the back of her chair. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. The posture alone was a message in a language Bruno understood perfectly. And Damian Alcazar, who had spent all morning at that table thinking about contracts and ports and nothing that had anything to do with unknown women, discovered in that moment that it was completely impossible to look away. There was something about her that went beyond the urgency of the situation. Her eyes had asked him for something without saying it in words. The way she had sat down with her back straight, despite the fear he could see in the tension of her hands. A woman who asked for help without humiliating herself. That was rare. That was, though Damian would not have admitted it in that moment under any circumstances, absolutely fascinating. Bruno had stopped about 10 feet away. He was looking at the man in the suit with the expression of someone who has just encountered something that wasn't in his calculations. "And who are you?" he asked, his voice still controlled. Damian looked at him the way people look at the instructions for a household appliance, briefly, and with complete disinterest. "The man giving you the opportunity to walk out on your own." Bruno opened his mouth. Closed it. Something in the manager quietly reaching for his phone, something in 2 suited men who had appeared near the entrance without anyone seeing them arrive, something in the completely calm way the stranger held his gaze without any visible effort, made Bruno recalculate. "This isn't over," he said, looking at Valeria. "For you it is," replied the man. Bruno left. The glass door closed behind him with a soft, almost elegant sound, completely at odds with what had just happened. Valeria waited 3 seconds. 5. 10. Then she turned her head toward the man who was still standing beside her and who was now looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite classify, but which held something of curiosity, and something of the patience of a man who already knows how this is going to end. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome. I don't know your name." "Damian Alcazar." Valeria paused. Even though you already knew mine. Something crossed his expression, so quickly she wasn't sure she'd seen it. Do you have somewhere to go? He asked. Valeria thought about the room in Lavapes, the 12 days of rent she had left, and Bruno, waiting for her somewhere between that cafe and anywhere she might go. Yes, she answered. Damian looked at her with the same precise attention he'd turned on Bruno. He said nothing more. Damian Alcazar had several unwritten rules that governed his life with the precision of a contract. He didn't arrive late. He didn't improvise. He didn't get involved in problems that weren't his. He didn't postpone meetings. He didn't take strangers to his office. That Wednesday, he broke 5 of those rules in under 15 minutes. Wait here, he told Valeria and walked to the back table to say goodbye to the Swiss businessman he'd spent 3 weeks coordinating this meeting with, a man who was now looking at his phone with the diplomatic discretion of someone who understands that something has just changed the plan. Damian apologized, rescheduled with a glance, and walked back. As he crossed the cafe toward her, he did something he didn't usually do. He actually looked at her. During the scene with Bruno, he'd been focused on the other man, on angles, on the exit. But now the immediate danger had passed, and she was still sitting at his table with her hands still over the folder and her back straight, as if she refused to fall apart even though she had every reason to. Damian saw her, the dark, wavy hair falling over one shoulder, slightly disheveled from the confrontation with Bruno, the large, expressive eyes still carrying the adrenaline of the last few minutes but already processing, calculating, looking for the next move. A mouth that had the shape of mouths that say exactly what they think. She wasn't the kind of woman who stops time when she walks into a room. She was something more interesting than that. The kind of woman who makes people in the room wonder who she is. Damian set that thought aside with the efficiency he applied to everything that didn't serve the immediate situation and sat down across from her. Do you have a car? He asked. No. The guest house where you're staying, does it have security? Valeria blinked. How do you know I'm staying at a guest house? Because if you had your own place, you wouldn't have walked in here to look for work with this much urgency. That was irritatingly logical. It has a key and a front desk lady who falls asleep at 9, she admitted. But I can. Men like that don't leave, said Damian. They recalculate. And when they think conditions have changed, they come back. Valeria opened her mouth. Closed it. He was right. That was also irritating. I can't go anywhere with a stranger, she said. You just sat down at my table without knowing me. That was an emergency. So is this. I have an office on Castellana, a conference room with a lock, employees present, no place where anyone can hurt you. Valeria studied his face. She looked for some signal that there was something behind the offer, interest, intention, the kind of kindness that isn't really kindness. She found none of it. The man wasn't looking at her as a woman in that moment. He was looking at her as a problem that required a solution. Which was, coming from where she'd been, the most reassuring thing anyone had offered her in a long time. Why? She asked. Because I was here. That's not a sufficient reason for me. Yes, it is. Valeria looked at the folder on the table, at the glass door through which Bruno had left, and at Damian Alcazar, who was waiting without pressuring her and without moving. Just until this afternoon, she said. As you prefer. It was not just until that afternoon. The narrator would like to pause here and acknowledge something. Damian Alcazar had spent more time than he could calculate living without improvising, with his life perfectly ordered, silent, under control. And in under 15 minutes, a woman he had never met had sat down at his table, invented that she was his girlfriend, dragged him into a scene he hadn't agreed to, caused him to cancel a 3-week meeting, and was now sitting in the back seat of his car looking out the window as if none of this was a big deal. Damian looked at the back of Valeria Marquez's head and thought, with the clinical detachment that defined him, that this was exactly the kind of chaos he had decided never to have in his life again. And he was completely right about that, which, as usually happens with the things we are completely right about, changed absolutely nothing. Alcazar Global's offices on the Paseo de la Castellana occupied 2 floors of a building that looked understated from the outside and made very clear from the inside that understated and austere are 2 entirely different things. Valeria walked in behind Damian and made a point of not staring, which was what she'd learned at La Moraleja, that people with real money could spot when someone was impressed, and that the best way to not look out of place was to act as if you'd already seen it all. Which didn't stop her from quietly taking in everything. Damian showed her the conference room, told her there was coffee down the hall, that no one would come in without knocking, and went back to his own affairs with the efficiency of a man who doesn't need more words to make things clear. Valeria was left alone. In the sudden silence of that long-tabled room with its leather chairs and the view of Castellana through the floor-to-ceiling window, she had the first moment all day when nobody was watching her, nobody was waiting for her, nobody was looking for her. Which should have been a relief. It was, instead, a strange combination of relief and the sharp awareness that her entire life was in a folder on that table, and that every next step depended entirely on her. She called Lucia. Lucia Marquez was 21 years old. She was in her 3rd year of psychology at Complutense University and answered the phone without saying hello when she'd gone more than an hour without knowing where her sister was, which was frequent, because Valeria had the habit of getting into things without warning and the luck of coming out of them all right, though luck, like everything, has its limits. Between the 2 of them there were 10 years of age difference and a history that had bound them in a way that goes beyond blood. Their mother had gotten sick when Lucia was 9 and Valeria was 19, just starting work, and Valeria had learned to be sister and mother and support all at once without complaining too much. Lucia knew this, she didn't say it, because Lucia was the kind of person who prefers to show things rather than say them, but she knew it. And Valeria, who would have walked into fire for her sister without thinking twice, was the main reason she had stayed beside Bruno so long, because Bruno held a debt her father owed, and that debt was a chain. "Where are you?" asked Lucia without saying hello. "In an office on Castellana." Pause. "Whose?" "A man named Damian Alcazar." Longer pause. "Explain that from the beginning." Valeria explained. She listened to the silence on the other end shift in texture, from worry to astonishment mixed with the visible effort of not laughing, which was Lucia's specific combination when something surprised her but she didn't want to give her sister the satisfaction. "You sat down at a stranger's table and told him you were his girlfriend," summarized Lucia. "Yes." "And he played along in 2 seconds." "Yes." "And now you're in his office." "Yes." "Valeria." "I know. Google his name." There were no photos. There were economics articles, infrastructure contracts, a line in the Financial Times mentioning him as one of Europe's fastest-growing entrepreneurs in corporate security. A LinkedIn profile so sparse it looked deliberately minimal. "He's real," said Valeria. "How real?" "As in the kind who doesn't give interviews and has bodyguards who don't look like bodyguards." Silence. "Stay where you are and don't do anything strange," said Lucia. "I never do anything strange." Valeria. "You sat down at a stranger's table and told him you were his girlfriend." "That was a tactical emergency." Damian came back at 2 in the afternoon with 2 sandwiches, which he set on the table without comment. "You didn't have to." "They were the last ones in the cafeteria," he said, sitting across from her. "If you didn't take them, they were going to throw them out." Which was a lie and they both knew it. Valeria took the sandwich because she'd been hungry since 9 and because it was the most considerate excuse anyone had given her in a long time. They ate in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable. The kind of silence that exists between people who owe each other nothing and therefore don't feel the need to fill it. Valeria, who had the habit of watching people when they didn't know they were being watched, looked at him for the first time without the urgency of the cafe pressing down on her. Damian Alcazar ate with the same economy of movement he applied to everything else, large hands, straight posture even in a conference room chair, the line of his shoulders under his shirt, because he'd taken off his jacket when they arrived, and that was enough for Valeria to notice that this man did not have the shoulders of someone who spent his life behind a desk. There was something physical about him that didn't quite match the suit and the contracts. Something that suggested open spaces and work done with the hands, not just the mind. She was still looking when he glanced up from his sandwich and caught her. Valeria didn't look away. That wasn't her style. Neither did Damian. But something shifted very slightly in his expression, something small enough that Valeria filed it away to process later. "How long has he been following you?" Damian asked, without preamble. 2 years. He just looked at her. And Valeria had the feeling that gaze was archiving everything. Family. 1 sister. Lucia is at Complutense. Does he know where she studies? The sandwich lost all its flavor at once. "I don't know," said Valeria. "He knows," said Damian. Not with cruelty. With the same neutrality he might have used to say it was going to rain. Which didn't make it any less devastating. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, because she had been carrying that question for hours and couldn't ignore it any longer. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. You cancelled a meeting." Damian folded the sandwich wrapper. "Set it aside. Because I was here. That's not a sufficient reason for me." "Yes, it is." Valeria searched his expression for something more. She found nothing. The man seemed genuinely convinced that his reason was enough, and that, in itself, was something Valeria didn't know how to handle. She had strategies for every kind of man she had ever met. She had none for this one. At 5 in the afternoon, Damian offered her a flat in the Salamanca district, executives in transit, magnetic key, cameras on the exterior, fully self-contained. "No," said Valeria. "It's temporary." "No. There's no one else there." "No, Mr. Alcazar." "Do you have a specific objection, or is it a general principle?" "Both." "Explain the specific one." "I'm not the kind of person who accepts an apartment from a man I just met. With all the respect I have for you, which is considerable, given this morning, I'm not going to be in debt for that kind of favor." "It wouldn't be a favor. It would be a security measure. For you it might be the same thing. For me it isn't." "And the general principle?" "That I spent 2 years with a man who also started out by protecting me, and ended up believing that gave him rights over me." Silence. Not the comfortable kind from before, a different kind. Denser. The kind that settles when something lands with more weight than intended. Damian nodded once, slowly. "Understood," he said. And he didn't push. Which was itself an answer Valeria hadn't expected. In the end, they reached an agreement. One of the security team would accompany her to collect her things from the guest house and take her to Lucia's apartment in Malesana, a building with a doorman, neighbors, people. Safer. "And tomorrow," said Damian, "if you want to keep looking for work, call before you go out. I don't need anyone to know where I'm going." Valeria, it was the first time he'd used her name without the formal address. And something in the way he said it made her go still. "That man is not going to give up," she said quietly. She'd known it since Bruno walked out through that glass door with "this isn't over," which was both a threat and a promise. "Call before you go out." She would. "Thank you," she said. The security team turned out to be Ramiro Castillo, enormous, not in the athletic, imposing way that Damian was, but in the way that makes door frames seem smaller than they are. He had the face of someone not particularly interested in anything, which Valeria would discover later was completely misleading. "Miss Marquez. Whenever you're ready." Valeria picked up her folder and turned to Damian, who had returned to his papers. "Mr. Alcazar." He looked up. "Thank you. Genuinely. This time it's different from before." Damian looked at her. "I know," he said. And he didn't look away until she had walked out the door, which, though Valeria didn't know it in that moment, was highly unusual for Damian Alcazar. That night, sitting in the ordered silence of his home office, he thought about her eyes, which had looked at him from that chair asking for help without words. He thought about the way she had crossed the cafe without hesitating, even though she was terrified inside. He thought about how long it had been since anything had made him stop and think about something other than work. Which was, he decided, completely irrelevant. And he filed it away. Though that particular file took longer than usual to close. Bruno appeared outside the Malasana apartment the next morning at 8. He didn't do anything, just stood there, leaning against a car, watching the building entrance. That was enough. Valeria saw him from the window and called Damian before she called the police, which would have told her a great deal about who she actually trusted, if she'd had time to analyze it. Damian picked up on the second ring, listened, said, "Stay in the apartment," and hung up. 25 minutes later, Bruno was gone. Valeria never found out what happened in those 25 minutes. Damian didn't explain, and she didn't ask, because there are some answers that are better left unspoken. Bruno came back 4 days later, near the restaurant where Lucia and Valeria had arranged to have lunch. That evening, Damian called her. "I need you to come and stay at my house," he said. "No. Perimeter security, cameras, a full-time team." "No, Damian. The circumstances have changed. This man has your sister's schedule. Her routes. The bus she takes from campus. The air shifted." "How do you know that?" "Because I've been investigating him since the day in the cafe." Valeria looked at him. Damian held her gaze without apologizing for having done what he considered necessary. "This man isn't just a difficult ex," he continued. "He has people with records, contacts inside the police, and he has the address of the Malasana apartment. 3 testimonies from people he's lent money to who are willing to testify. Recorded audio of 2 of his men. The names of 2 officers he's bought. All of it verified, all of it in the hands of a prosecutor who has been looking for exactly this for 6 months." Valeria thought about Lucia. About her flatmates. About Carmen, the 62-year-old building doorwoman with a hip replacement. "Just me," she said. "Lucia doesn't need to be involved in this. If Bruno has her address, Lucia is already involved." That was brutally correct. "I need to talk to my sister." "Of course. And if I come, it's temporary, however long we need. And I'm going to keep looking for work." Something crossed Damian's expression, which he controlled before it fully reached his face. "We'll talk about that." "We will not talk about it. I'm going to do it." Neither of them looked away. "The estate," he said, shifting tactics with the smoothness of someone who has spent years negotiating. "A property outside Segovia. More isolated, more controllable. Horses, space, long-term staff. Less than an hour from Madrid. And Lucia's classes. Classes end the first week of July. We're on the 15th. There was no logical counter to that. 3 weeks, said Valeria. 3 weeks, and we come back." Damian didn't say yes. Didn't say no. "Fine," he said. And that sounded exactly like "we'll see." The Alcazar estate sat on the border between the provinces of Madrid and Segovia, 50 minutes from the city along a country road, in a valley enclosed between 2 low hills, where the silence was so complete that for the first few nights Valeria woke up thinking something must be wrong. It was spectacular. Not in the way that places people have decorated to look spectacular are spectacular, but in the way that places which have spent decades being exactly what they are become spectacular. A large stone house with a red-tiled roof. An inner courtyard with a fountain that ran all day. Stables with 8 horses that smelled of earth and hay and something warm that Valeria couldn't name. And a kitchen large enough to house an entire family, which instead housed Señora Amparo. Señora Amparo was 68 years old, with white hair pulled into a tight bun, a striped apron, and the gaze of someone who has seen many things and kept most of them to herself. She showed Valeria and Lucia to their rooms, explained the meal schedule, pointed out where the spare towels were, and then looked at both of them with an expression that was not hostile, but not exactly welcoming either, more like an assessment. Don Damian has breakfast at 7, she said, looking at Valeria. He doesn't like noise before 8. Understood. And he doesn't like anyone going into the west stable without letting him know first. Also understood. And he doesn't like anyone moving things on his desk. Señora Amparo, said Valeria with the careful patience of someone who understands that certain people have to be earned, I am not going to touch his desk. I'm not going to make noise before 8. And I'm not going to go into the stable without permission. Is there anything else I should know? Señora Amparo studied her for a moment. That the machine coffee is a disgrace, she said. If you want real coffee, come down to the kitchen. Valeria understood that this was the best welcome she was going to get, and she accepted it. Damian at the estate was a different person, not different in the sense of a changed character. He was still a man of few words, precise movements, and silences that took up more space than most people's conversations. But there was something in the way he moved through that house that he didn't have in the Castellana office. Something more settled. As if in the city he carried the weight of being Damian Alcazar, the executive, and at the estate he was simply Damian. Valeria saw it for the first time on the second morning, because she had never been good at sleeping in new places. She came downstairs barefoot to get coffee and found him in the inner courtyard, his back to her, speaking very quietly to one of the horses that had leaned over the fence of the side stable. She couldn't see his face, just heard the low voice with that tone people use when they talk to animals and don't know they're being overheard. Completely real, without a single layer of control on top of it. Valeria went still in the kitchen doorway. She told herself she didn't want to interrupt him, that she was going to wait until he finished so as not to make noise before 8, that it was a matter of respecting the house rules. None of those three things was entirely true. The truth was that she couldn't move because she was watching a man with his back to her talking to a horse in a low voice in a stone courtyard at 6:30 in the morning, and that was, for reasons she couldn't quite explain, the most disarming thing she had seen since the café on Serrano. Damian turned and saw her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Coffee, said Valeria, holding up her empty mug as evidence. The machine's at the back, he said. Señora Amparo says the machine coffee is a disgrace. Something shifted very slightly in his expression. She's right, he said. And he went into the kitchen to make her coffee. Valeria stayed in the courtyard looking at the horse, who was looking back at her with the specific philosophical expression that horses have, and thought that she needed to be more careful. The rhythm of the following days established itself on its own, with the naturalness of things that happen when no one plans them. Damian worked from morning in the upstairs study, with Ramiro stationed at some strategic point outside and a permanent connection to his team in Madrid. He ate in the big kitchen rather than the dining room, because Señora Amparo had convinced him of that 20 years ago. He finished work before 7 and, if the weather allowed, went out to the stables. Valeria spent her mornings exploring the estate with Lucia, helping in the kitchen when Señora Amparo permitted it, which at first was never, and gradually became sometimes. Her afternoons she spent searching for jobs in the nearby villages with a determination that Damian watched with a mixture of respect and something that closely resembled unease. There's a restaurant in the village, Valeria told him one afternoon at the kitchen table, her laptop open. They're looking for a waitress. The hours are. No, said Damian from the doorway. Valeria looked up. I didn't finish the sentence. You didn't need to. There's a man looking for you, and you want to go and wait tables at a village restaurant. The man looking for me is in Madrid. Nobody knows I'm here yet. I need to work, Damian. I can't stay here doing nothing for weeks. I offered you a position in one of my companies. A position handed to me. That's not the same thing. It wouldn't be handed to you. Yes, it would. Valeria closed the laptop. Look, I appreciate the offer, genuinely. But you know as well as I do that if you give me a job, it's because you need to keep me where you can see me, not because you actually need an employee. Damian didn't answer immediately. Which Valeria had learned was his way of saying she was right, while changing nothing about his position. I'm not trying to control you. I know. I'm saying that would be the effect. A pause. I need a job that is mine. That I got myself. That depends on me and no one else. Silence. The village restaurant, he said at last. The village restaurant. Ramiro goes with you. Ramiro can wait outside. Ramiro goes in and eats. Valeria opened her mouth to protest. Then she thought about Ramiro eating in the village restaurant as undercover surveillance and, against her will, found that slightly amusing. Deal, she said. That was the best gastronomic decision of Ramiro Castillo's life, though he didn't yet know it. Casa Petra had been in the same village location for 32 years, the same handwritten chalk menu on a board, the same Petra running the kitchen, the same smell of beef stew drifting out the door from 11 in the morning and making people in the square instinctively look up. Valeria walked in on the first day with her best smile, her La Moralegia references, and the resume that was still perfectly pressed. Petra hired her in 10 minutes, because Petra had spent 3 months looking for someone who didn't panic during a full house and could carry 4 plates at a time without dropping them. Ramiro walked in behind her, sat at the corner table with a view of the door, and ordered the daily menu. The daily menu was Castilian soup, cocido madrileno, and homemade cheesecake. Ramiro ate all of it. The next day he came back. The day after that, too. By the end of the week, Petra was saving his corner table without being asked and bringing him fresh bread from the oven before he even sat down. Is your friend coming every day? Petra asked Valeria between tables, with a mixture of curiosity and professional satisfaction. He's not exactly my friend. Your boyfriend? Not that either. Valeria glanced at Ramiro, who was reading the newspaper with the expression of someone not paying attention to anything in particular, while in fact paying attention to absolutely everything. My shadow, she said. Petra nodded with the wisdom of a woman who has seen many things in 32 years of restaurant life. Well, he eats well. That's always a recommendation. 12 days into Valeria's work at Casa Petra, Damian looked at Ramiro in the courtyard and frowned slightly. Ramiro. Is that a different vest? Ramiro didn't blink. No, sir. Then the vest is shouting. Pause. The village restaurant has excellent food, said Ramiro with the full dignity of a man who has decided the situation requires no further explanation. Damian looked at him for a moment, then nodded and went back to his study. Valeria, who had overheard the exchange from the kitchen, had to press her hand over her mouth not to laugh. The narrator wishes to note at this point that Ramiro Castillo was a man of principles. One of those principles was that personal distractions did not exist on the job. Another was that objectives were achieved with precision and no deviation. And another, the most recent, was that Petra's cocido was the finest thing he had ever eaten, and if that compromised his professional image, it was a reasonable price to pay. Principles, like everything in life, have hierarchies. Lucia Marquez had spent 4 days at the estate before she said a single word to Ramiro, not because she was shy, but because Ramiro was the kind of person people waited to have something specific to say to. There was something in his posture, in the way he occupied space without moving more than necessary, that suggested small talk was a scarce resource he rationed carefully. On the 5th day, Lucia brought him coffee. Ramiro was stationed on the side porch with a view of the estate entrance, his usual position, when Lucia appeared with 2 mugs and put one in his hand without asking. He looked at her. I didn't ask for coffee. I know. I brought it anyway. Lucia leaned against the wall beside him, looking toward the same point he was looking at. Do statues with earpieces also blink, or is that beyond their capabilities? Ramiro blinked. Demonstrated, said Lucia, drinking her coffee. Ramiro looked forward for a moment. "Thank you for the coffee," he said. "You're welcome." A pause. "Tomorrow I'm coming with cookies. Consider this a warning." And she left. Ramiro stood watching the entrance path for exactly 30 seconds longer than necessary. The cookies arrived the following day. Butter cookies, homemade, made in the big kitchen with Señora Amparo, who had watched them being made with the expression of someone who didn't want to admit she was enjoying the company. Ramiro ate all of them on the porch, standing up, looking toward the path with the face of a man thinking about perimeter strategy, and absolutely nothing else. "Are they good?" asked Lucia from the doorway. "They serve their purpose," said Ramiro. "Cookies don't have a purpose. Everything has a purpose." Lucia looked at him with the expression of someone who has just found an interesting project. "I think we're going to get along," she said. Ramiro didn't answer. But that night, before falling asleep, he thought that Valeria Marquez's sister was the most curious person he had met in a long time. That this was a problem. That he was going to ignore it. He ignored it for exactly 4 days. It was during one of those 4 days that something happened, something Damian filed under things that were not happening. Valeria had been working at Casa Petra for 10 days when a man named Marcos, the restaurant's wine supplier, 40 years old, square jaw, with the habit of leaning on the counter with too much familiarity, decided that Valeria was exactly the person he wanted to talk to while he waited for Petra. Damian walked into the restaurant that day, something he did once or twice a week, with the excuse of checking on Ramiro, just as Marcos was telling Valeria something that was clearly making her laugh, both elbows on the bar, at a proximity that wasn't necessary for telling any joke. Damian sat down at the nearest available table. Ramiro, who had spent days as a front-row observatory, looked at him. Then looked at Marcos. Then looked back at Damian with the expression of a man carefully calculating whether the daily dessert is worth the calories, which was his expression for "I am not commenting on this." Valeria saw Damian, smiled at him from the bar, and kept talking to Marcos. Damian ordered water. Just water. No coffee, no food, no logical reason to be sitting there staring at the tablecloth. When Valeria finished her shift and they walked out to the car together, Damian said nothing about Marcos. He didn't ask who he was. He didn't make a single comment. He drove with the same calm as always and talked about the horses and about the weather changing the following week. Valeria looked at him sideways from the passenger seat. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Perfectly," he said. "Sure." "Yes." Pause. "Do you know Marcos?" said Valeria, with the studied innocence of someone who knows exactly what they're doing. "Who?" "The wine supplier. The one at the bar." "I didn't notice him." Valeria turned toward the road so he couldn't see her face. "Of course," she said. Damian didn't respond. And Valeria decided that silence was the most satisfying thing she had heard in a long time. They had been at the estate for 17 days when Valeria made a decision. It was a decision she had been putting off since the first week, since she'd started noticing the way Damian looked at her when he thought she wasn't looking. Since she'd started noticing how he tensed slightly when she came closer than necessary to reach something in the kitchen. Since she'd started noticing that the conversations between them lasted longer than they needed to, and neither of them did anything to shorten them. Damian Alcazar had spent 17 days looking at her with the most carefully packaged desire she had ever seen in her life, and he was not going to make a move. It was perfectly obvious that this man could spend the rest of his life looking at her exactly that way and denying it until the end of time. Valeria, who was a woman who had learned patience in many things but had a natural limit for absurdity, decided to help him along. She showered with the jasmine soap she'd found in the bathroom, the one she knew he liked, because the second time she'd used it, she'd watched him inhale almost imperceptibly as she passed him in the hallway, which was exactly the kind of detail Valeria stored away like ammunition, without yet knowing what for. She put on her cream cotton shorts, the shortest ones she had, and a white t-shirt knotted at the waist. She pulled her hair into a bun that wasn't trying to be perfect and was absolutely trying to look effortless. Then she went down to the library. The estate's library was a long room with oak shelves reaching to the ceiling, 2 armchairs by the window, and a rolling ladder for the upper shelves. Damian spent the last hours of the afternoon there when he finished work, which Valeria knew because she had spent 17 days learning his schedule with the silent precision of someone who is pretending not to pay attention. He was there, standing in front of one of the back shelves, a book in his hand, in his shirt sleeves, because at that hour he always took off his jacket. "Hi," said Valeria from the doorway. "Good afternoon," he said, not turning yet. Valeria walked in, stopped by the rolling ladder, and looked up at the upper shelves with an expression of genuine need. "Can you help me with something? There's a book up there I can't reach." Damian turned. His gaze dropped, for 1 second, one single involuntary second, the way eyes drop when the brain hasn't quite finished giving the order not to. Then he looked back up. And went very still. "Which one?" he said. Valeria gestured vaguely toward the highest shelf. "The red one." There were 4 red books on the highest shelf. Damian walked to the ladder, climbed 2 rungs, took all 4, and handed them to her. Valeria looked at them. "Picked one at random." "This one." "Fine." Damian came down from the ladder. He was standing less than a meter from her, and she was still looking at the cover of the book with an attention he knew perfectly well wasn't real. "Anything else?" Valeria looked up. The distance between them was uncomfortable in a very specific way, the kind of discomfort that happens when 2 people are close enough that the situation calls for one of them to move, and neither of them moves. "Damian," she said. "Yes. Are we really going to keep doing this?" He looked at her. "This thing where you walk into a room I'm in and you stop at exactly 1.5 meters away, always, like there's a line on the floor you can't cross. This thing where when I pass you in the hallway, you hold your breath, yes, I notice that. This thing where you look at me when you think I'm not looking, I notice that too, because I've spent 3 weeks learning when you're looking at me." Silence. Damian didn't move. He was very still with the specific stillness of men who have learned that not moving is the closest thing to control they can manage in that moment. "Valeria," he said quietly. "Don't tell me I'm misreading the situation, because we both know I'm not. Don't tell me it's complicated, because everything worth anything is complicated." She took a step toward him. "And please, Damian, don't pretend you feel nothing for me when you come in with those shoulders, those eyes, that intensity, and act like nothing is happening. Because something is. And you feel it too." The silence that followed lasted approximately 3 seconds. Then Damian took a step toward her, took her arms just above the elbows, his large, firm hands, but without squeezing, and looked down at her with an expression that held none of the controlled composure of the past weeks. "Woman," he said very quietly, very close. I couldn't hold back anymore. Valeria felt the floor of the library lose a little of its usual solidity. "Then we're 2, she said, because neither could I." Damian lowered his head and kissed her. It was not the kind of kiss you give someone you've just met. It was the kind you give someone after 3 weeks of not doing it, which is worse and better at the same time. Slow at first, with the concentration of someone who wants to get it right. Then deeper, when she ran her fingers through the back of his hair and both of them released the last grain of patience they had left. The red book ended up on the floor. Neither of them picked it up. The narrator needs to take a moment, just one moment. Damian Alcazar, who had spent years without improvising, without yielding, without letting anything break through the perfectly controlled architecture of his life, had just kissed a woman in his library because she had come downstairs in cotton shorts and jasmine perfume and told him to his face that she wanted him. And the thing is, Damian had no argument against that, none that mattered to him, anyway. The following evenings at the estate were different. The first began in the library, with the 2 of them standing near the fireplace that Damian had lit without anyone asking him to, because July nights in the countryside carried that dry plateau chill that appears without warning. Valeria had a glass of wine she didn't remember asking for and was watching the flames when she felt his hand on the back of her neck, slowly, as if giving her time to decide. She didn't need time. She turned, and he was very close, with that stillness of his that no longer seemed like coldness to her, but like the specific calm of men who, when they do move, move with intention. The glass found its way to the mantelpiece. Damian ran his fingers along her jaw, tilted her face up, and looked at her for 1 second before kissing her, a second that Valeria felt from the back of her neck to the soles of her feet. She whispered to him that she was sure. He closed the door behind them. What came next belongs only to them. The fireplace held its secrets with more discretion than any narrator, and the stone walls of the estate have been keeping confidences for centuries. What can be told is the following morning. Señora Amparo found 2 empty wine glasses on the library mantelpiece and a red book on the floor that nobody had picked up. She washed the glasses, put the book back in its place, and said nothing, because Señora Amparo had spent 20 years in that house knowing exactly when to be quiet. Valeria came down to the kitchen at 8 with her hair still damp from the shower and the expression of someone who has slept well for the first time in a long time. Damian was already there by the window with his coffee, and when he heard her come in, he turned with that gaze of his, the one that filed everything away, and looked at her from head to toe, in the same way he had looked at her the night before, except now there was nothing left to hold back. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning." Valeria picked up her mug and leaned on the counter beside him, shoulder to shoulder, looking out at the courtyard through the window. Nothing more needed to be said. Some good mornings don't. In the days that followed, something settled between them, not an agreement, because no one had put it into words, but something with the solidity of agreements. He sought her eyes when she walked into a room. She left his coffee ready before he came down to the courtyard. They sat together at the same time in the kitchen and talked about things that had nothing to do with Bruno, or security, or how much longer they were going to stay. They talked about horses, about the villages of Segovia, about the 3 years Valeria had spent at La Moraleja learning that people with money had exactly the same fears as people without money, just more expensive ones. He told her about ports, about the logistics of moving things from one continent to another, about how a 4-hour delay at a port in Rotterdam could affect the price of olive oil in Seville. She listened with the focus of someone learning something new and enjoying the learning. And he watched her while he talked, with the expression of someone who couldn't remember the last time he had spoken about work to a person who was actually listening. What neither of them mentioned was Elena. Valeria didn't know her name. She knew something had happened, because Señora Amparo had let it slip once, saying that Don Damian hadn't had anyone at the house in a very long time, with the face of someone who immediately regrets having opened her mouth. Valeria didn't ask. She filed that information away with the care of someone who knows that certain doors only open from the inside. The first time Damian tried to act as though she had no life of her own outside of him, it was a Tuesday, when he arrived at the restaurant to collect her before her shift ended because he had received word that Bruno had been asking about her in Madrid. "I need us to go back to the estate," he said from Casa Petra's doorway, in the tone of someone accustomed to things being done as he says. "I have 40 minutes left," said Valeria, a tray in her hands. Valeria. 40 minutes, Damian. Bruno has been asking about you in Madrid. Bruno has been asking about me in Madrid for 2 years. She looked at him from the table she was serving. 40 minutes won't change anything. Wait outside. Damian looked at her for a moment. Then looked at Ramiro, who raised his shoulders slightly from his usual table with the air of a man who has no comment on the matter. Damian waited outside. In the car, on the way back to the estate, there was a silence with a different texture than their usual ones. "I can't ask you to stay on the estate and not go out," he said at last, eyes on the road. "No," she confirmed. "But I need you to understand that every time you go out, it's a risk." "I understand that. And I need you to understand that if I don't go out, I'm going to lose my mind, and a Valeria who has lost her mind inside an estate is a worse problem than Bruno." Damian didn't answer immediately. "Then, that is probably true. Completely true." The silence shifted again, back towards something more like normal. "There's something you haven't told me," said Damian without changing his tone. About Bruno. About why you stayed trapped beside him for so long. Valeria looked out the window. My father owes him money, she said. A loan from 4 years ago to pay for my mother's surgery. Silence. How much? How much, Valeria? 22,000 euros. With the interest Bruno charges, it's considerably more by now. Damian said nothing. She didn't look at him. They both knew the conversation had reached a point where what came next was going to matter. I don't want you to pay it, she said. I know. I mean it. I know that too. Damian. Valeria kept looking at the road. He didn't turn. I won't do anything you don't ask me to do, he said. She looked at him. He didn't glance over. And Valeria, who had a great deal of practice distinguishing between men who said what they wanted people to hear and men who said what they intended to do, thought that this might be true, or it might not be. That there was no way to know yet. So now you know. Damian paid the debt without telling her. And Valeria has reasons to be furious and reasons to be grateful, and doesn't know what to do with both things at the same time. The call came on a Thursday afternoon. Lucia was in the village with Ramiro, who had taken her to the local library, because Lucia had discovered that the municipal library had a surprisingly impressive collection of social psychology texts for a town of 3,000 people, and that the librarian had a fascinating theory about attachment bonds that Lucia wanted to discuss at length. Ramiro was waiting at the entrance. Lucia's phone rang. An unknown number. Hello. Hi, Lucia. The voice was soft, familiar in a way that took her a second to place. It's Bruno. You remember me? Lucia went still. I know where you are, Bruno said. And I know where your sister is. I just want to talk to her. Tell her to call me. Tell her to call before I have to come and find her. He hung up. Lucia walked straight out of the library and went directly to Ramiro. Ramiro. Her voice was very controlled, in the way of someone who is being very controlled. I just received a call from Bruno. Ramiro was moving before she finished the sentence. Valeria was in the kitchen helping Senora Amparo when she heard the car in the courtyard. She came out and saw Lucia's face before her sister said a single word. I'm fine, said Lucia. But Bruno has my phone number and he knows we're here. Damian appeared in the study doorway 30 seconds later. He looked at Ramiro. Ramiro put the phone in his hand with Bruno's number on the screen. Give me 10 minutes, said Damian. Valeria looked at her sister. Lucia was pale, but steady, with that solidity of hers that Valeria sometimes forgot existed because she was too busy protecting her. Hey, said Valeria quietly. Are you all right? I'm angry, said Lucia. That's different. 10 minutes later, Damian came back into the kitchen. He had the phone in his hand and the expression of someone who has just closed several doors at once. The number is a prepaid card, he said. But we have the location from where he made the call. He's in Madrid. For now. For now, Valeria repeated. He has the general location of the estate, not the exact address. But that changes if he moves. What do we do? Damian looked at her, at what he had been preparing for weeks to prevent it from ever reaching this point. I have enough on Bruno to hand to the prosecutor, he said. Illegal loans, documented extortion, 3 testimonies from people he has lent money to who are ready to testify. Audio recordings of 2 of his men. The names of the 2 officers he's bought. Everything verified, and already in the hands of a prosecutor who has been looking for exactly this for 6 months. Silence in the kitchen. How long have you been gathering that? Asked Valeria. Since the day in the cafe. Valeria looked at him for a long moment. And you didn't tell me. I didn't want you to feel like I was managing the situation over your head. And weren't you? Damian didn't answer. Yes, she said. You were. The air in the kitchen shifted. Señora Amparo, with the instinct of someone who had lived in that house for 20 years, gathered her things and slipped out to the courtyard without a word. Lucia went with her. "I wanted to protect you," said Damián. "I know. But do you see the difference between protecting me and deciding for me when you tell me things?" "Valeria. Bruno wanted to keep me locked away because he said I was his. You want to keep me somewhere safe because you say I'm in danger. But from the inside, Damián, the two doors feel too much alike." Silence. Damián was looking at her with an expression that was neither the composure of the first weeks nor the openness of the recent nights. It was something harder to read. And for that reason, more real. "You're right," he said. "I know your intentions are good. That doesn't make it right." "No." Damián leaned back against the counter. He looked down for a moment. "There's something else I didn't tell you," he said. Valeria waited. "Your father's debt to Bruno. I settled it 10 days ago." The silence was different from all the ones before. "Without telling me." "Without telling you." "Damián." "I know. I told you I didn't want you to do it." "I know. And I'd be lying if I said I'd do it differently, because that debt was the reason he believed he had power over your family. Removing that argument was the first thing that needed to happen." Valeria looked at him for a long time. "I need air," she said. And she walked out to the courtyard. Bruno took 4 days to reach the estate. Not because he was careful, but because it took him that long to get the exact address, through a supply vendor who had been making deliveries to the property for 2 years and turned out to be more susceptible to money than he should have been. Those 4 days, Valeria and Damián lived in a state that wasn't exactly distance, but wasn't what it had been before either. They talked. They ate together. She kept going to the restaurant with Ramiro. He kept letting her. But there was something suspended between them that neither of them knew how to resolve yet. Valeria thought about the debt that had been paid, and the anger she still felt, and the more complicated fact that underneath the anger there was something that closely resembled gratitude, and she didn't know how to hold both things at once. Damián thought about what she had said about the two doors that felt the same from the inside, and how those words had landed in a place that had been unused for 6 years. The night Bruno came to the estate, Valeria was in the stable. She shouldn't have been there at that hour, past 11. But one of the horses, a chestnut that Señora Amparo called Cabra, and whom Valeria had been visiting every afternoon until the animal had decided to tolerate her, was restless. She had heard him from her window and gone down without thinking too much about it. She was inside the stall with one hand on Cabra's neck when she heard the side door of the stable open. It wasn't Damián. Damián opened doors a different way. And it wasn't Ramiro. Ramiro always gave a signal before entering, because they had agreed that 3 weeks before. Bruno Salvatierra walked into the stable with a flashlight and an expression Valeria had seen before, the expression of a man who finally has what he wants and doesn't yet know he won't be able to keep it. "I told you this wasn't over," he said. Valeria slowly let go of Cabra's neck. She breathed. "Bruno. Stop. Now." He took a step forward. "Valeria, don't make me." "I was never yours," she said, in a voice that did not tremble. "That was your mistake from the beginning. You thought you had me because you had a debt from my father. That debt no longer exists. You thought you needed me because it suited you to have me. But I was never a thing that belonged to you, Bruno. Never." Bruno looked at her. Something crossed his face that might have been rage, or might have been the beginning of the realization that he had miscalculated, the same expression he'd worn in the cafe on Serrano, weeks ago. "Who paid the debt?" he said. "The billionaire." "That's none of your business." "Yes it is. Because now he owes me." "He owes you nothing." "Valeria." "It's over, Bruno." The stable door opened. Damián came in first. Ramiro 2 steps behind. And behind Ramiro, though nobody had asked her to come down, Señora Amparo, with a flashlight larger than Bruno's and an expression that made it perfectly clear that if anyone was going to cause trouble in her stable tonight, they were going to have to get through her first. Bruno turned. Damian looked at him the same way he had looked at him in the cafe weeks ago, without hostility, with the brief, completely dispassionate attention of someone who already knows how this ends. "There are 2 cars at the front of the property," said Damian, "and a prosecutor who has been waiting 6 months for this call. You can walk out on your own, or you can be carried. Your choice." Bruno looked at Valeria. She said nothing. Bruno chose to walk out, because it was the only calculation he had left. Ramiro accompanied him to the cars. Señora Amparo looked at Damian, then at Valeria, then at the horse, who was watching the whole scene with his usual philosophical air. "I'll keep the coffee warm," she said, and left. Damian and Valeria were alone in the stable. He came toward her. She didn't move. He put one hand on her jaw, slowly, looking at her. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she said. "Sure." "Yes." Damian looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were dark and his expression was that of someone who has reached the limit of what he can control. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. "Now. Tonight." Valeria waited. "I had a wife," said Damian. She said nothing. "Her name was Elena. She died 6 years ago in a car accident. She was coming back from a meeting I had cancelled at the last minute. If I hadn't cancelled it, she wouldn't have had to go alone." The stable was very quiet. Cabra was chewing hay. From outside, very far away, came the sound of cars on the path. "I've spent 6 years believing that protecting someone was the way to keep from losing anyone again. What I actually did was make sure I had no one left to protect." A pause. "Until a woman sat down at my table without permission and told me she was my girlfriend." Valeria felt something soften in her chest. "Damian, I paid your father's debt without telling you because I couldn't stand the thought of Bruno having that threat. Not because I didn't trust you. Because I have 6 years of practice cutting anything that could hurt the people I care about. And I did it without thinking that you are not Elena." "What do you mean?" "I can't repeat that mistake in the other direction." "What mistake?" "Deciding for the people I love, because I think I know better than they do what they need." Valeria looked at him. "Do you understand that now?" "Yes." A pause. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything. Tell me how you want to be protected." Valeria thought for a moment. "I want to work. I want to make my own decisions. I want you to tell me when you're afraid, instead of acting like you're not." "And the debt," she began. "You don't have to pay it back, Damian." "Valeria, I'm going to pay it back. Little by little. Not because I'm not grateful. Because I need it to be mine." Damian looked at her for a moment. "Done," he said. "And one more thing. Tell me. I don't want to be your charity case. I don't want to be your employee. I don't want you to take care of me like a responsibility. You are none of those things. Then what am I?" Damian dropped his hand from her jaw, took her by the waist, and drew her close. "I don't want to be your owner," he said, his voice very low. "I don't want to be your savior. I want to be the man you choose to come back to, even when you no longer need to hide from anyone." Valeria looked up at him. "That's a lot," she said. "Yes. And if I choose it, then I'm not going anywhere." Valeria raised her hand and touched his face. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if that were the hardest thing to receive of everything that had happened that night. "I choose you," she said. Damian kissed her. Cabra, who had been witnessing all of this with his usual philosophical patience, snorted and went back to his hay. Señora Amparo, who had clearly not gone very far, came in 3 minutes later with hot coffee. She found them exactly as she expected to find them. She set the mugs on the stable bench and left without a word. Though this time she didn't wait until she was back in the hallway to smile. Bruno was arrested that same night, on the documentation Damian had passed to the prosecutor, plus an illegal entry onto private property that nobody was going to forgive. The 2 officers he had bought were suspended pending investigation before dawn. The legal process would take months, but what mattered was that the chain had been broken. Bruno was not coming back. The following week was the most peaceful Valeria had known in 2 years. It was also the week she discovered what was happening between Lucia and Ramiro. It wasn't a dramatic revelation. It was an afternoon when Valeria came down to the kitchen for water and found her sister sitting on the counter with a cup of coffee, talking to Ramiro, who was standing in front of her with his arms crossed and an expression that was not his usual stone face, but something considerably softer, and they both went very still when Valeria walked in, like 2 people who had rehearsed exactly this moment and still weren't ready for it. Valeria looked at Lucia. Looked at Ramiro. Looked back at Lucia. "Hi," she said. "Hi," they both said, with the perfect simultaneity of people who have rehearsed exactly this and are still not prepared. Valeria took her water and went upstairs to the study where Damian was working. "Lucia and Ramiro," she said from the doorway. Damian looked up, looked at her. "How long have you known?" asked Valeria. A pause. 10 days. "And you didn't tell me." "It was their business." Valeria looked at him with the expression of someone processing new information. "You learn fast," she said. Damian went back to his papers, but she saw the corner of his mouth move. That afternoon, Damian called Ramiro to the study. Valeria, who was not eavesdropping, but simply happening to pass down the hallway more than necessary, heard part of the conversation. "Ramiro." "Sir." "Lucia Marquez." Silence. "Sir, I assure you that at no point have my professional responsibilities." "I'm not asking about your professional responsibilities." Another silence. "I care for her," said Ramiro in a voice that was different from his usual voice, quieter, more real. "Well. I should hope so," said Damian. "Because she is the sister of the woman I love, and that makes her territory where mistakes are not permitted." "Understood?" "Yes, sir." "And Ramiro, stop calling me sir when there's no one around. That's enough of that." Valeria left the hallway before Ramiro came out, but she held on to that phrase. "The woman I love." She held it the way she had held on to "I couldn't hold back anymore" when he kissed her, and "I was there from the first day," and all the things Damian Alcazar said without knowing she was archiving every one of them. Valeria's table opened 18 months after the café on Serrano, in a ground-floor space in the village, 200 meters from Casa Petra, with whom it shared customers Monday through Wednesday and competed amicably the rest of the week. A small restaurant, 8 tables, a short menu, an open kitchen, and a name painted by hand above the door that Señora Amparo said was too simple and Valeria said was exactly right. Damian provided the space. Valeria put in the work, the menu, the name, and the refusal to let him have any say in any operational decision, which he respected with the discipline of someone who has learned that certain battles simply don't exist. Ramiro remained a regular customer. His vest continued to suffer. The wedding was at the estate in September, with the hills of Segovia in the background and the smell of earth after the rain the night before. It wasn't a big wedding. Valeria's family, Damian's team, Petra and her husband from the village restaurant, Señora Amparo with her impeccable bun and the expression of someone who had been waiting 2 years for this without admitting she was waiting. Lucia was the maid of honor. Ramiro was Damian's best man, arriving in a new suit, his shoulders completely free of the vest drama, and with Lucia on his arm, because they had been together for 8 months and were no longer hiding it from anyone, which was still a subject of comment at the estate, though no longer of surprise. Señora Amparo cried during the ceremony. She told anyone who would listen that she was not crying, that something had gotten into her eye. The same thing that had gotten into her eye when Lucia and Ramiro announced their own engagement, 3 months later. 5 years after a Wednesday in July at Café Serrano. The Alcazar estate's inner courtyard held, at 7 in the morning, a 3-year-old girl named Clara, who had inherited her mother's wavy hair and her father's way of looking at the world, and who was chasing a cat that had no intention of being caught. Damian was watching her from the porch with the expression of someone who, for 3 years, had been unable to get to work at the time he wanted, because there was always something more important happening in the courtyard. "Papa," said Clara, stopping dead because the cat had vanished. "Did Mama really sit down at your table without asking?" Damian looked at her. "Who told you that?" "Señora Amparo." "Señora Amparo talks too much." "Is it true?" Damian stepped down from the porch, scooped her up, and settled her on his shoulder with the ease of someone who has been doing this before his morning coffee for 3 years. "Yes," he said. "And I was very annoyed." "Why?" "Because it took me 2 seconds to understand what was happening. And then? And then the rest of my life to be grateful she'd chosen me to run into." Clara considered this with the gravity of her 3 years. "And was the cat in the café yours?" "There was no cat." "How boring." Valeria appeared in the kitchen doorway with the other coffee, hers, watching them with the specific smile of people who listen to conversations while pretending not to. Damian turned and found her there. He said nothing more about the cat, or the table, or any of it, just looked at her the way he had always looked at her, from that very first moment, with the same dark, unhurried, completely certain gaze. Valeria crossed the courtyard, put his mug in his free hand, and gave him a brief kiss at the corner of his mouth. Then she lifted Clara from his shoulder. "There's a cat in the stable," she told the little girl. "Go find it." Clara shot off like a rocket. Damian and Valeria were left alone in the courtyard with their coffee and the morning sun and the sound of the fountain that had been running the same way for 20 years. "Señora Amparo is telling her things," said Damian. "Good," said Valeria. "Someone has to." He looked at her. "Are you happy?" It was the same question he had asked her in the stable the night of Bruno, and the one he asked her sometimes still, not because he thought anything was wrong, but because he had learned that asking was better than assuming. "Yes," she said. "As always." "Sure." "Completely." A pause. "Although I could do with someone to look after Clara on Friday. The restaurant needs me for the lunch service. Ramiro is free on Friday. Ramiro looks like he wants to murder the cat. The cat survives everything." Valeria laughed. That was what Damian had learned to wait for every morning. That laugh that appeared where nobody expected it, and made the courtyard seem larger. From the stable, Clara announced she had found the cat. From somewhere on the perimeter, Ramiro said something in a low voice that nobody heard, but which was probably a tactical observation about cats and 3-year-old girls. Señora Amparo appeared at the kitchen window to see what was happening. She saw Damian and Valeria in the courtyard. She evaluated them with her usual gaze and went back to her things. Though before she did, very briefly, in the exact space between the window and the kitchen where nobody could see her, she smiled.